Hello, everybody. Welcome to our annual pre-high holiday house party. Something that we weren't able to do last year, and in a way we're still not able to do this year. Right here we are. We tried to think about doing it in people's homes, and we tried to think about, could we really? Is this really good time for? Anyway, that's really our topic for the night. The truth is, we're going to be very meta in a way tonight. In that part of what we're asking is like, is this okay? Do we like this? Is this good? Is what we're doing right now, studying Torah together online, is it a good thing? Is it a worthwhile thing to do? Does it hit in the way that that being together in person hits? I have been doing this now. I've been doing this a lot, probably more than you. I've been sitting here learning online with you all for the last, I don't know, year and a half, more now. And it's been unquestionably my source of life and strength and inspiration. Like, it's kept me, you have kept me alive. I really believe that in this last year and a half. But at the same time, like, I have to say, if you had asked me to start teaching online before all of this, I would have said, ick, like, no, I don't want this. That's not real. It's not like real Torah learning. I want to be with people. And that's part of the question that we're asking tonight, and that we at Ikar have been asking in different ways now for over a year and a half. Like, what is it that we're doing? What is it that we're doing here on this screen, and how good can it be? How real can it feel? How deeply can it hit us? What is sacred space? What does it mean to build sacred space? And do you actually need to be in space? And what kind of space do you need to be in? So these are questions that, we're heading into the high holidays, and you would think that we would be gathering together to study Rosh Hashanah, to study Yom Kippur, but the kind of meta topic that's been consuming us, maybe us all, but certainly us here at Ikar for these last months, is this question. Like, what does it mean to construct sacred space? So as we begin this question, I wanna, like, as a rabbi, I'm thinking, well, what does our tradition have to say about this? Is there Jewish wisdom on the project of constructing a kind of portable, temporary, makeshift, sacred place in a time of great crisis and calamity? Is there Jewish wisdom on that? And I've seen the head nods. Of course, yes, there is. Resoundingly, yes, there is. There is not just some Jewish wisdom, but core Jewish wisdom. This is, in some ways, one of our most ancient technologies. This project of responding to crisis by creating a different kind of sacred space, this goes all the way back, or almost all the way back. It goes back to the book of Exodus. And that's where we're going to start tonight. We're going to start by looking at the original Jewish attempt to construct a plan B, a different kind, an alternative kind of sacred space. Let's just say a blessing to make this space sacred. Let's say just a blessing over our learning tonight, just to sanctify this gathering. Okay, so we'll say a blessing over Torah learning. It's just thanking God for allowing us to talk together in this way, and it ends with La'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. So I said, is there Jewish wisdom on this question? How do you construct temporary sacred space? And I saw the nods. The answer is yes. And the answer is yes, because many of you are thinking of the tabernacle. The portable temple that was constructed in the desert. These slaves running for their lives are also thinking about, well, can we have sacred space here? And the answer that God gives them is the tabernacle. So we're going to go and we're going to look at the tabernacle. And the only other thing I want to say by way of introduction is for you kind of language people out there, for you Hebrew people out there, or even for you non-Hebrew people out there, pay attention to one word as we move through. And the word is, well, in Hebrew, we talk more about roots of words than words, but the root is shin, kaf, nun, and one of the words that is formed by that root is shachen, like neighbor. The core meaning of that root is dwelling. That's the way I'm going to translate it tonight, dwelling. Okay, so pay attention to all the dwellings you see tonight, because if you follow that word, we're going to see it evolve and morph as it moves through Jewish history. Okay, so let's start our conversation, and I'm going to give you a source sheet to take a look at. We're going to look at some sources all together, and then at a certain point we'll maybe break up into smaller groups so we all have a chance to really dig in here. But here's the source sheet for tonight, and we're going to start with a very classic text, like one of the most classic of Jewish texts, the kind of thing that's inscribed on the side of synagogue walls. The opening description of this tabernacle. So far, I've just used the English tabernacle. And one of the first things we're going to be looking for is, what is it called in Hebrew? What are these words that are used to describe it in Hebrew? But the tabernacle. And we're going to look specifically at the most famous line in that opening section, verse 8 in chapter 25 of the book of Exodus. So let's take a look here. I'm going to screen share so we can, but you have the link if you need it. So this is our starting point. This is the text in question. This is where that ancient technology begins in the book of Exodus. And God says, okay, bring all the materials together, and then va'asuli mikdash v'shechanti b'tocham, and let them make me a mikdash, a sanctuary. It's often translated as that I may dwell among them. There's your first instance of this word. V'shechanti b'tocham. Shechanti is the word here, that I may dwell among them. Okay, exactly as I show you the pattern of the tabernacle. Okay, and that's the word we translate as tabernacle, but there's the second usage of this same root, mishkan. So it's literally a dwelling place. And the pattern of all its vessels, so shall you make it. So here it is. Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. That's a very famous line, but also one that's going to require a lot of unpacking, because what does that even mean? What does it mean for God to suddenly dwell among them? But before we get there, we'll soon get there. Let's just think for a second about what there are two words here used to describe this thing. Did you track the two words? Okay. Two words are, I'm just letting you say it out loud. The two words are mikdash and mishkan. Okay. And I have all my rabbi friends here with us tonight. We're all going to be in conversation together and all doing a little bit of teaching. And so, rabbi friends or anyone in the crowd, tell me, like, these two words. What is the meaning of mikdash and what is the meaning of mishkan? I translated, one is sanctuary and one is dwelling place. So, like, how are those two words different, and how do they relate? Okay, let's put those two words into dialogue with one another. Anyone out there, anyone who's got a thought about mikdash and mikan, the holy place, the dwelling place, the holy place, the dwelling place. Jody, are you starting to percolate?
I was going to just say the obvious is one is about holiness, sanctification, and the other is, which is more spiritual, maybe individual, and the other is more collective, community from the neighboring part. The dwelling, it's not, I'm just going to come here for you personally. It's for all of you.
Okay, good. So there's something that is going to be sacred about this place. And that almost feels like back away. Holiness is often something you don't get into, you like respectfully regard from a distance. But then it's a dwelling place. Are we all going to dwell there? Like it seems we're all going to gather there in some way. Right? But who's doing the primary dwelling? Who's the dweller? All right, people are nodding. Brianna, who's the dweller?
Well, in the sanctuary, the dweller's God, and in the home, it's me.
Okay, that's a better answer than I expected.
Oh.
That's a better answer. I expect you to say God. God is the dweller here, and that's the big question. What does that mean? God dwells. That's the big question. If we only ask one question tonight. But Brianna begins to answer the question by saying, yeah, I mean, dwells like a neighbor dwells, like I dwell in my own house. So that's what we're saying. We're saying God is going to live, come down, dwell, occupy this space in the way that I might be occupying my space. What the heck does that mean? I mean, this is really the $10 million question. Make me a sanctuary that I may dwell amongst them. How does God dwell amongst us? What does that even mean? Any thoughts on that? We're just supposed to sort of understand that. God says, I'm going to dwell among you. What does that mean?
I'll just jump in here. Can you hear me with the earbuds? So if we're thinking about the root shachen versus the root kadosh in mikdash and mishkan, and when we think about the word, we can think about the word kadosh in lots of different contexts, but I think especially about it at the end of Shabbat, when we're separating the week from Shabbat, we call Shabbat holy and we call the rest of the week mundane. And that somehow we learn about what kadosh is by what it's not. And we talk about something being holy versus being mundane. And so something about it, it's separate, it's different. And so when I think of mikdash as like a sanctuary, a holy place, I think of it as being separate, away from something. Again, it was kind of mentioned before, like it might be something I would approach maybe with awe or even fear. Whereas a mishkan or something that has that word shachen in it, like it sounds familiar, it sounds homey, it sounds like someplace I could go.
Good. So there's a little bit of seeming like a little bit of tension here. This is going to be the sacred place, but also like it's homey. God's getting homey with us. And I think, Rabbi Lebel suggests that this is distinct. So maybe that's one way of resolving that tension, is saying, oh, it's a distinct kind of dwelling. It's a special dwelling. It's God's dwelling. That's different. So again, what is that? Is it different? Brianna was almost saying, no, it's sort of the same. God comes home, right? Or God's arriving to God's place at the end of the day or something like that. Any other thoughts on this, on what it means it's okay. That's a question we probably will never answer, but we don't have to answer it in the first few minutes. But any other thoughts on what it means for God to dwell? To dwell? I'll just add one thing, which many of you know, which is that the word right after I will dwell is among them, right? V'shechanti betochem, among them. And that's this word in Hebrew. And okay, so God's going to be down here in our midst. But one of the traditional strains of interpretation is, I'm going to dwell among them. There's another way to read that word. I'm going to dwell in them. Okay? So if you make this thing, I will dwell in you. Now that's even weirder. What is it? What would it mean for God to be in us, among us, inside of us? Like, is this making any sense to anyone? Anyone have a sense of how this works? Okay. All right. This is the thing. This is the technology. This is the idea. If we build it, God will come. Right? This is what it means to create sacred space in the most temporary, use whatever materials you have as you're traveling through the desert kind of way. But eventually we move through the desert, and this is what we do to summon God's presence down. That seems to be the goal. And then eventually we arrive in this new land of milk and honey, and we're there for a while when God announces a new plan, a new place. And God says, actually, now we're going to build something bigger and better, okay? Bigger and better. And you will know this probably as the great temple in Jerusalem. So the one that no longer exists, or at least we have just only little pieces of left. So let's just take a look at one step forward We had the tabernacle, and let's just look at one other version of a dwelling place for God before we really dive in tonight and start tearing this apart. So this is way further on, hundreds of years later, about 400 years later, in the book of Kings, and God's talking to King David, or King Solomon, sorry, and the word of the Eternal comes to King Solomon, and God says this: with regard to this house you are building, if you follow in my laws and do my justice and faithfully keep my commandments, I will fulfill for you the promise that I gave to your father David. God had mentioned this to David earlier. I will dwell among the people of Israel, and I will never forsake my people Israel. Okay, so there it is again, same kind of language. I will dwell among the people of Israel. Again, I don't know if we've totally figured out what that means, but we've got a new word. We've got a new word now. We had sanctuary, mikdash. We had dwelling place, mishkan, and now we've got a new word. What's the new word? Bait. I see people mouthing it. Bait, a house, a house. And in fact, this will become known as the Beit HaMikdash, the sacred house, the house of the sanctuary. Okay. Now, God's going to do the same thing here. God's going to dwell. But what's different? Why is this? What is it different? What's different when you start calling it a house? What is that? What does that mean? Why does God want a different structure? He already got the tabernacle. What's different here? Anyone?
Well, it makes the most of that home idea. We were talking about the tension between sanctified and everyday or homey, and by it makes it a home.
Okay. It's a very dwelling word, right? Like God's got a home now. And you can kind of dwell anywhere for a bit. But this is like God's actually going to have a permanent place. Like God's going to live here all the time. This is God's house. Right? This isn't just God's apartment. I mean, maybe think of it that way, right? Or God's tent. This is God's house. So, wait, you cut out, Mira.
God's Airbnb.
God's Airbnb. All right. Great. Because God's not there all the time.
It's like making a commitment more, right? Like laying down roots in a home, right? Making that transition from a dwelling place or an apartment to a house, right? Is saying like, all right, I'm okay in this. I'll stay here for a while.
Sorry, I have.
Okay, good. So that's right. We've got now a couple of models, one of which is by its very nature, temporary, impermanent, could like sort of, as I said, plan B, sort of constructed in response to the moment. And the other one is this big plan, and I finally put a down payment on my house and I'm in escrow, and it's like, it's that kind of feeling, like I'm gonna really grow roots, I'm really settle in here. So I guess the last question I have for you is that better? Is the temple a better version of a dwelling place for God, a worship place for us, than the tabernacle was? Is the whole point of this movement from Exodus to the book of Kings is like, oh, now we're finally, that was just like, what are you going to do? You're wandering through that, but this is it. Is the temple a better dwelling place? Any thoughts? I'm seeing no's. I'm seeing no's. Yeses, no's.
I would say no, partially because we know how the story goes. So there is that.
Say what you mean by that, Jody.
I mean, we know we're going to be exiled. And so we know that if you say, one way was, I'm going to be among you and portable, wherever you go, I'm with you. This is, you need to come to me. If you want to worship me, you need to come to this particular spot. And that's more limiting. What if you can't get to that particular spot? What if you're sick? What if there's COVID? What if? So it has a limit to it. There's a permanency to it, kind of, but since we know how the story ends, it actually isn't permanent.
Ah, okay, great. Okay, it's permanent home, all the ways you could describe a bite, they all sound like that's a good thing. Everybody, you want a home. But Jody is saying, yeah, the permanent is great. The problem with permanent is what happens if that's the space, if it's your home, if it's then what happens when you lose the home, when the home, burns down in a fire, And in fact, Jody said, that's exactly what happened. That is our story. We finally built this big, permanent, beautiful building, and then it was destroyed and we were sent into exile. So all of the energy of having this one spot is suddenly for nothing. Okay, Kathy, I saw you going to respond.
Yeah, I was going to say, it also just strikes me that just in terms of text, the weight of the text, there's so much of the Torah spent on the Mishkan, the temporary. I mean, describing it and then describing it again, the sort of repetition of it all, and the fact that it's so central in Torah, just in and of itself gives it a kind of a weight that we can't avoid. And in fact, it sort of seems like sometimes we get can kind of conflate the temple and the tabernacle, right? We say, oh, well, this was done, or this is done, in the temple, when what is being described in the Torah is really what's happening in the tabernacle. So I think it's kind of, yeah.
Okay. Kathy Kobayashi, tantalizing as ever. Kathy's suggesting something very radical here. She's like, maybe actually the tabernacle was always it gets so much attention. Maybe that's actually the paradigm. The Torah spends all of its time talking about the temporary structure. Maybe actually we're supposed to be thinking about and tuned into the temporary nature of the tabernacle, not as a plan B, not as a b'diavad, but as an ideal. As an idea. Is that possible? Is a structure that is portable actually better? What advantages does that have? Are there limitations to a real solid foundation structure building?
Listening to you, I have the sense that we get very preoccupied or distracted in the physical. We're always involved in the brick and mortar of the temple, the physicality of it. But like you said midway before, the Spirit of God resides within us all of the time. You can burn down a temple, you can't burn down the Spirit of God that dwells within us. It is always there. Just as we are meeting together in this Zoom environment, it's always here. It's always amongst us. And we get kind of stuck in this physical, one temple, two temple, it's there, it's gone, it's there, it's gone. It's always here. It's within us all the time. And that means a lot to me, and it really resonates with me a lot, especially in the context of when we're discussing here and sharing here. So here we are. The temple's here amongst us all the time. Here we are.
This is it. Okay, remarkable. We're already getting to such deep places here. Just deep, sort of startling, radical places. The idea that maybe the temple is almost a distraction from the real experience that was always the real experience, which is that God dwells amongst us. Okay, wait, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So what I want to do is take the hands that are up, sort of gather our final thoughts. I see Emily and I see Matt, and then we're going to break out into, and I see Rabbi Tzadok, and then we're going to break out, and we're perfectly set up now as we're questioning, we're sort of weighing permanence against temporary, and already seeming to maybe lean on the side of temporary, right? Which is like the less intuitive. That's a good setup for exactly where Jody was taking us, which is, well, what happens when the temple is destroyed? Okay, but let's take the thoughts that are the hands that are up. Let's start with Emily.
Yeah, this makes me think of two experiences with synagogues that I've had as an adult. My previous congregation in Palo Alto, and a little bit also Ikar, that when we started, we were small and we met in a church. I'm speaking of Etz Chaim in Palo Alto. We met in a church, and then we grew, and then we decided to buy a building, which was a YWCA, and everyone was worried, well, what happens when we buy a building? And when we fix it up, let's be careful. Let's not make it too fancy. We still want this to be Hamish. We want this to represent us. We have to be really careful. Because we all came from these, like big reform or conservative synagogues, and where everything was about the trappings. And the reason we had come to these other congregations was to get away from, you know, the building. And then we found, well, actually, we kind of do need a building. Just like when you first buy a house, you're like, well, why should I buy a house? I've always rented an apartment. It's been fine.
Yeah.
And so you want to put down those roots and you want to own something that you need to take care of, but you don't want it to take over your life or your religion or your community. So maybe there's some kind of warning in there in this text about that.
Lot of really insightful stuff. Melissa Balaban, does any of that sound like familiar reckoning to you? I mean, that's like, you said it, Emily. I mean, that's us. That's who we are as a community. And before the pandemic, we've just finally arrived at that decision. Like, well, we don't really want to get too ossified, too institutional, but we do kind of need a space. So in the end, we're going to build a building. But let's make sure it stays homey, and let's make sure, right? That dilemma that you're pointing to, Emily, is a dilemma that we feel very strongly. And it's a deep and difficult dilemma for Jews in a way, because isn't our whole religion about not worshiping objects and buildings and structures, right? So like, isn't it just about us? You know, as Alan was just saying, it doesn't matter where we are. And at the same time, just like for King David, it's nice to have a space. It's nice to have a place, a big, beautiful place. So there's a dilemma there. Matt.
Yeah, I now have two things to say. One is there's another option, which is there's a tension in the Torah about multiple holy places, not centralized in Jerusalem, not sitting in our hearts, but like where Jacob, becomes Israel, and I mean, Isaac becomes Israel, and we've got the stone, and we get a place. There are various times we do that, as though there's a decentralized location oriented. But I also wanted to say that whichever.
Can I stop you for a sec there, Matt? Because you're pointing to something that, like, we're like, savvy Jews, so we're very quickly like, wait, no, permanent is bad. Like taking the deeper, more contradictory position. But Matt is reminding us of there is some desire to have a place, to have a Zion, a Zion, like a locator point that actually matters. And our ancestors are always kind of, well, let's put a stone here, let's mark this. That actually has a meaning for us to be able to go back again and again to a place. And even in our lives today, it has a meaning for us to walk to Shalhevet and to feel like, oh, this is my space and this is where I pray. And it's not just, oh, where will I be this week? So there's something valuable about that. Let's not forget that as we head into the rest of our conversation. Matt, you had a second point.
Well, yeah, I want to sum up this whole thing, which is that the answer here, there isn't an answer, but the answer defines who you are. I think the Judaism I love, the Judaism that is so meaningful to me, is because we lost the central place. I don't think if we had kept the temple and been a thriving Middle Eastern nation for the last 2,000 years, I wouldn't be a Jew who goes to Jerusalem to sacrifice some animals because something happened in my life. Okay. That's not a thing about my life that I want, but these things define us. The rabbis were forced to make a religion that was us sitting around and talking about things and making a collective decision because they didn't have another option.
Okay, all right. So this isn't, I'm going to turn this into a question because Matt makes a very, very important point for our whole, our whole peoplehood, our whole everything, which is that there is a possibility, there's a way of looking at our story as a thriving in the midst of adversity. That's the whole point, is that we do well when we are challenged, when we have to want the whole, and especially since the temple was destroyed, who we have become as a people is the makeshift, do it on the spot, travel around and just construct your Judaism's in books, Judaism's in minds, Judaism's in heart. It's not in places, right? So there's a way in which that's become defining for who we are. And maybe that's precisely, some would suggest, what has kept us around all this time. All right, I am well over my time here, so I'm gonna turn it over to Rabbi Tzadok, who also had her hand up, but also perhaps will take us into this next section. What we're going to do now, and I think we're well set up with these two models, the permanent and the temporary, is to look at, so what happens when the big, beautiful permanent building is destroyed? Where do we go from there? And we're going to break up into smaller groups so that we all have a chance to do some learning. So Rabbi Tzadok, did you have a thought, and do you want to set that up for us?
Oh, I am good. No, I'm good. I'm
You're
good with my without my thoughts. Yeah, I am happy for us to set that up, but we're gonna put everybody into a small breakout room, maybe with one of our rabbis. It'll be intimate, which I think will be fun for all of us. But I think Rabbi Kasher, you set us up pretty well, as did everybody with our comments. The temple was destroyed, as many folks know, in the 6th century BCE by the Babylonian kingdom, and I think the question is, what happens then, right? What happens to one's relationship to God, to Shekhinah, right? Which we'll see a little bit about that concept of the divine presence. And what is it that we might do, right, in exile, or our people might have done. So we'll take a look at the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, Megillah. So let's see if I can kick us out into breakout rooms. Does somebody else want to do that? I will do that. Let's see. Anybody? Me? Okay, I'm on it. If anyone wants to say words while I get us set up, we can.
Well, I'll say some words, which is just like, even this is all very meta tonight. Even this decision, which we talked about, like, should we have a breakout room? Like, these decisions are also the kinds of questions that we're asking when we're thinking, how will we have a sacred experience together online? Can we do it with 30 people talking in one room, or do we need to, like, these are like real questions that we're asking. How do we create sacred experience? How do we really learn Torah together? So this is yet another attempt to create that space in the midst of all of our challenges.
All right.
Are we all
So
back? Okay.
I think everyone is back. We've got about 15 minutes before we wrap up, and we have one more text that we really want to share that kind of takes us from where we left off in this Talmudic text of wondering what it means for the dwelling, for Shekhinah to have accompanied us through our exiles, and then where within the exile is the Shekhinah found in our houses of prayer/gathering, and our houses of study, and what happens in those places that maybe makes them so welcoming to the Shekhinah. And this next text, I think, takes it one step further. So clergy friends, I'm making the executive call to pass it to Rabbi Tzadok because of where we are in the clock, if that's okay. And Rabbi Tzadok, take us home.
Baton passed. All right, friends. Just going to walk through this text, and I don't think it's going to be a surprise where it goes, but it's still, I think, a beautiful one. And just with gratitude to my fellow rabbis, and to Rabbi Kasher in particular for helping to create put these texts together for all of us to learn, and to all of you for taking the time and sharing a little holiness, creating our own Beit Midrash in this space. Teaching in Pirkei Avot, which you can follow along with if you want to go back to that link, but you could also just listen. Rabbi Chalata of Kfar Hanania said, when 10 sit together and occupy themselves with Torah, the Shekhinah abides among them. As it says in Psalms, God stands in the congregation of God, right? And so we think about 10, and that feels like, oh yeah, I could see that, right? A Beit Knesset, a minimum minyan. That feels like that would be where God's presence would dwell. But the text continues. But how do we know the same is true of even 5? Well, it says this band of gods has established on earth from Amos. And this feels a little bit like Abraham, arguing to save Sodom, but way better, because it keeps going. And also, this is just about people coming together, and God coming to dwell among them. Well, how do we know that three people bring the presence of God into their space? Well, as it said, God judges among the judges. We know 3 is the minimum number we need for a court. Well, how do we know that God's presence abides among even 2? Well, this quote from Malachi, right? Those that feared the eternal spoke with one another, and God listened and heard. This adds, not only is God present, but God is an engaged partner in conversation, which for me, the word dwelling makes me think of really just like being together as well. And then what about just one? And here's I think one of the most important pieces of Torah for this time, which is, even if one person sits and studies Torah, God's presence is there with us, with you. In every place where I mention my name, I will come to you and bless you. One thing that came up in my group, if I can just share it, is, when we read our text, it feels like God's presence is traveling and going into Batei Knesset and Batei Midrash, into houses of gathering and houses of study. But the way we were talking about it was actually a little bit more empowering to people, I think, or we had that influence, right? When we come together, when we study Torah, when we pray, when we think, when we explore, we're actually opening that window, opening those doors to the presence of God that's just waiting to come in, right? And someone in my group talked about, not just having the trappings around of Jewish life, but actually doing exactly what we're doing right now. And this text gives us a little bit of a gift of, like, wherever I mention my name. So God's saying, look, even if you're struggling to do the studying, I'll put my name there. I'll be there, right? Like, I'll meet you. You just have to be a little bit open to it. So as we're entering into our high holiday season, I just want to ask if you could put in the chat one place, one moment, one experience that you've had of a mikdash me'at, your own mini sanctuary, whether that was by yourself, with one other person. Morning Minyan, I'm all about that one. If you haven't come. Right, just maybe a surprise, a mikdash me'at that you have experienced in the past year and a half, that maybe surprised you in that feeling of connectedness or community, or if God is the language that feels resonant to you in the presence of God. And as we go into, it's so fun to read all of these things, because it's also a gift to see where other people's mikdashim are. But moving into the high holidays, we know that some of us will be in a room together, some of us will be outdoors together, some of us will be home on Zoom together, or just home, right? Creating a meaningful celebration and experience. And I think what this learning in these texts offer us is that sacred, divine presence, holiness is there. And so if I can, may I close this out, rabbis? Offer a last word of blessing. I just want to bless us that we continue to open those doors and those windows to the presence of God, to the Shekhinah that's just hanging out outside or within, waiting to dwell with us. And that we all find this high holiday season meaningful, transformational, rolling with it, clarifying maybe, and an experience of connectedness, no matter how it is that you choose to celebrate. So thank you all for learning together.